I want to talk today about buses. These were a very important step for me as a mixer, and it was a little confusing at first, but basically what a bus is a group. So when you send all of the drum tracks, when you set their output to a bus, that's sending all the audio to a group. That is one track that you can then put effects on, and you can affect all of the drums together as a group instead of having to, do every individual track. But it becomes very useful when you start to get into things like sidechain, and when you start to get into using a lot of reverb and delay effects. It becomes very helpful. So I'll give a little example of how I typically do it. So for this track, I put the kick in the snare. I sent that. Well, no, I didn't, but I usually send the kick and snare to their own bus. And I'll call that KS, for kick snare. Then I'll send the hi-hats, the cymbals, the percussion, send that to a bus called CP, for cymbals and percussion. And then what I'll do is I'll set the output of the CP bus, the cymbals and percussion bus, and the kick and snare bus to a third bus, which is just drums. I just call it drums usually. And that's just all the drums and percussion in one track. So the way this usually comes in handy for me, and then anything like toms, claps, anything that's just random, I'll just send that straight to the main drum bus. So the reason I do it this way is I came to find that over making a lot of tracks, I always wanted to have the cymbals and the hi-hats, I always wanted to have them sidechained to the kick and sometimes to the snare. So if I send them all together into a group, the cymbals and percussion group, I can sidechain all of them at the same time. So I only have to set up one compressor, and it'll affect all of those cymbal and percussion instruments at once, instead of having to do that on every track. And kick and snare, I usually just like to have those on their own track. Just so I could, if I wanted to saturate the kick and the snare, or I wanted the kick and the snare just to be louder or quieter, or, maybe put a peak limiter on the kick and snare if it's like a 4 on the floor beat where the kick and snare are happening at the same time sometime, and you get this giant volume spike, but you want to contain that, but not affect, the rest of the stuff. I don't know. There's all kinds of, you'll find all kinds of ways that it becomes helpful when you start thinking about treating groups of sounds as well as, your individual instrument channels. So I do the same thing for bass, because a lot of times I'll have more than one bass sound going. For example, in this song, I've got this percussive bass, and I've got the very low frequencies of that bass filtered out because I have this other bass layer. Both of these bass sounds are from the Juno bass pack that I made, that I just released. So I set the output of those bass sounds to a bus, and I call that the bass bus. And usually the reason I do that is so I can sidechain compress all of the bass elements at one time. I can sidechain it to the kick, which is what I've done here. It's also helpful if you want to compress your bass layers to make them sound more, congealed, more gelled together, or, maybe put a saturation plug in and saturate all of your bass sounds at once. Or if you want to send all of your bass sounds to an effect, it's helpful for that. And it's helpful for the same reasons to do your other instrument groups like that. And in this song, it's I've got like a rhythmic chord thing I've got an arpeggio. And then I've got, big chords. So I just have those all grouped together on a bass, on a bus, synth bus. So if I wanted to, I could send that audio to a long reverb or something. In the case of this track, I've sent each individual ones of those sounds. I have different amounts of, reverb and delay send on each track. Which brings me to the next point here, effects. It's very helpful to have effects buses. Usually I'll have a short reverb, I'll have a long reverb, and I'll have a really long reverb, and then I'll have probably two delays. One of them like a dotted eighth note ping pong, and then another delay bus, which is like a mono, maybe eighth note mono. So that's what I've got in this project. If I mute all the effects sends. So what I'll do with my effects buses, usually this is mostly, like for this method, it's usually when I'm making more of an electronic type of song. But I'll gather all of my effects buses, all my reverbs and delays, and I'll set the output to an effects bus. Like I'll send all of those, I'll group them into another bus, which I'll label all effects. And that's just all of the reverb and delay effects all in one track. And the reason I do that is so that I can sidechain those to the kick and snare, so that they don't get in the way of the kick. Or, another thing you could do is if you've got a bunch of effects like that and you've got a vocal, you could sidechain those effects to the vocal as well, so that you could have a lot of reverb and delay, but then whenever the vocal comes in, it'll cut out, or it'll, attenuate those effects so that they're not, stepping on the vocal. But then when the vocal's done, they bloom. They bloom. So yeah, I usually send all my effects to a bus, all my drums to a bus, and all of my instrument groups to buses. And usually for me, it's either for convenience of sidechaining, convenience of saturating, or convenience of like compressing or EQing, a bunch of tracks at one time. If I wanted to saturate my drum bus, or, if I wanted to put a limiter on my drum bus to catch any errant peaks that were, sucking up my headroom. Yeah, that's usually how I do my bus routing. It was definitely a game-changing thing that when I started to get into that and experiment with how those could be used, and it's definitely helped me a lot. And it'll save on computing power too, because instead of putting a reverb and a delay on 8 separate tracks, you could send all those tracks to a reverb bus, and then you could have one reverb plugin that is providing reverb for these 8 tracks, and you could decide, you could adjust how much you want to send each into the reverb bus. I don't know if this makes things more clear or more confusing. I guess it depends on where you're at in your journey. But yep, that's how I set up my buses. Hope it helps.